document that attracted attention mentions an invitation addressed to Jaline Mascal. According to the file, it appears that Marcella was invited to a meeting identified as a shadow commission. Nahibado commission. The list of members was private and the main topic of discussion was related to the events of September 11, 2001. The document is dated 2003, that is, 2 years after the attacks. But there is another fragment that is stranger. A file dated only a week after the attacks contains a question that has bewildered many readers, which is Polcha, Bejas. Where is the real pilot? This sentence seems to cast doubt on the official version about one of the pilots of the planes. Kidnapped on September 11. It was simply private speculation. A conversation taken out of context, or the Shadow Commission really had something to do with it. It's impossible to say for sure, but the fact that the question appears in documents related to the case has fueled countless theories. Another email exchange caused even more confusion. In it, Jeff apparently jokes about something. In his own words, he would have sent him one of his clones. The message says, "These are the things your clone would do." Yes, that's right. One of his clones. Ooh, shones. The tone of the message seems humorous, but as is often the case on the internet, that phrase was enough for some to start connecting. The comment linked to much broader theories that speak of secret human cloning programs and experiments reserved for certain elites. It could also be an inside joke where the evil things they did on the island were made to seem like they weren't the ones they were doing, but rather they're evil clones, things that only happened on the island. A joke. Of course, there is no evidence to support these ideas. It is most likely simply a private joke or a metaphor within a conversation. But when these types of phrases appear in files linked to powerful figures, the ground becomes fertile for all kinds of interpretations.
There are 6 words that are really hard for most people to say. I need therapy, and that's okay. For a long time, I couldn't say those 6 words, and I stayed stuck. But one day, I just said it. Because what therapy gives you isn't something you can give yourself. A therapist is a neutral person, a human being who's not...
Another fragment that caught attention is related to the singer Justin Bieber. In one of the documents, a brief email conversation appears, in which the accent said, "Your pizza is yummy yummy." The message is dated 2015. Years later, in 2020, Bieber released a song titled Yummy. This could of course be a total coincidence, but some users began to notice something else. Within the declassified files, appears mentioned hundreds of times, more than 900 according to some analyses. And in certain internet circles, there's a theory that this word could have been used. This word thinks is a possible code. Something similar to what's been discussed for years in theories of theory. Does this mean that there really is a hidden code in these messages? Not necessarily, but it's flashing. Somebody comes to read. Does that mean? Not necessarily, but the simple fact that so many conversations use that word has fueled the curiosity of many independent researchers. In principle, it could simply be a conversation about food. After that, Jeff asks how he will handle the frozen albacore tuna. The answer comes from Francis Derby, who, according to the records, would be Jeff. The message goes something... The beef jerky. You can go to mine. In principle, after that, Jeff asks why. The answer comes about food. The message goes something like this. All in all. Yet, certain online users have challenged the phrasing in which the message is worded. For example, the phrase, "the dried meat will be with me." From a linguistic point of view, Many feel it would be more natural to say, I bring the meat, or I will bring the meat. But not the meat will be with me. But me? That does sound strange. To some internet analysts, such writing might suggest coded language, perhaps a way of referring to something, or someone using seemingly innocent words. And indistinct words. However, again, there is no concrete evidence that this is actually the case. It could simply be an unusual way of writing, or a context that we are unaware of. When you look at these documents together, it feels strange. Not because each fragment is the definitive proof of something, but because they all seem to leave little loose ends, details that don't quite fit, ambiguous phrases, coincidences that, taken in isolation, might not mean anything, even some kind of banky diminutive for which we have no context, ein. But the name itself is disturbing. Investigating a little more, I discovered that Baal is the name of an ancient deity worshipped in some cultures of the Hearing Middle. A god mentioned in historical texts linked to ancient civilizations, including traditions that is Babylonian and Canaanite. In certain historical accounts, the followers of this cult performed human sacrifices, even of infants, as part of their rituals. Now, there is no evidence that this name has any connection with anything in this context. It could simply be an unfortunate coincidence, but when it appears, in a case surrounded by secrets and theories, it inevitably arouses suspicion, urus, to. Another document that attracted attention mentions an invitation addressed to Jaline Mascal. According to the file, it appears that Marcella was invited to a meeting identified as a shadow commission. Independent research circles, not so much because of the event itself, but because of something that she herself had allegedly written some time ago, a post on social media that many remember today, Bokuma. In that message, Virginie wrote something that over time became disturbing. That message began to circulate massively after her death, and some people close to her raised questions about what happened. In fact, a family member even publicly stated that she expects a more thorough In other words, for many researchers, Virginia Euphra was one of the key players who helped uncover this entire scandal. Years after having uncovered much of this case, news arrived that left many bewildered. Virginia Euphra had died. The circumstances of her death quickly generated debate on the internet and in some independent research circles, not so much because of the event itself, but because of something that she herself had allegedly written some time ago, a post on social media that many remember today, Bokuma. In that message, Virginie wrote something that over time became disturbing. That message began to circulate massively after her death, and some people close to her raised questions about what happened. In fact, a family member even publicly stated that she expects a more thorough investigation by the Australian authorities, seeking to fully clarify the circumstances of the case. To many observers, the message that Virginie had published years earlier seemed difficult to understand, ignore, as it raises an inevitable question. If a person were truly considering ending their life, why would they leave a message citing the exact opposite? And there is another element that some analysts have also pointed out. If someone had wanted to retaliate against her, as some theories suggest, doing so immediately after her statements would have been too obvious. Yes. After all, when Virginia began speaking publicly, the media attention was completely focused on the case. A case. Anything that had happened at that time to her or to the victims who testified would have raised immediate suspicions. But if something were to happen to her years later, when the scandal no longer dominates the headlines, the impact would be different, much quieter, much more ambiguous, but the message would have been sent just the same. Speak, and you will no longer exist. Of course, this is still a hypothesis. The authorities have maintained their own version of events, and so far, there is no conclusive evidence to support any alternative theory. But the truth is that in a case already surrounded by mysteries, Virginia Euphre's story adds another chapter full of questions. Because if her testimony made one thing clear, is that many of the things that happened in Jeff's marriage circle remained hidden for far too long. And when a story like this begins to unfold, we don't always know where the truth ends and the silence begins. After reviewing documents, testimonies, videos, and theories, an unavoidable question remained: what really changed after all this? When one looks at the bigger picture, the feeling that remains is not exactly one of justice. Despite the magnitude of the scandal, the consequences have been surprisingly limited. Some of the central figures in the case are no longer alive. Jeff himself passed away in 2019 inside his cell while awaiting his trial. His death was officially classified as a suicide, but to this day, it continues to generate doubts among investigators, journalists, and much of the public. Another important figure who could have held a lot of information, modeling agent Jean-Luc Brunel, was also found dead in a French prison. Two key pieces of the story off the board. Meanwhile, Ghislaine Maxwell, considered by prosecutors to be one of Epstein's main collaborators, was convicted. In the United States, however, the footage seen at the beginning leaves us with a tremendous question mark as to whether this really happened. Better. The theory is that although there is no official confirmation, they continue to feed the mystery surrounding this entire case. You do. And then there are those who apparently do not seem to be affected by any of this. Some public figures mentioned in the documents have chosen to keep their distance, remain silent, or simply treat the matter as if it were a story of the past. He tends to be cussed. But not Bill Clinton. He apparently laughs his head off about all this. In certain interviews and public appearances, when images of social events where he met Jeff have been shown, his reaction has been interpreted by some as surprisingly relaxed, as if it were all simply an uncomfortable anecdote. All this has left a disturbing sense of impunity because when a scandal of this magnitude involves powerful figures, one would expect much more forceful reactions. But in many cases, what we see is something else. Silence, distance, or simply indifference. And that brings us to another phenomenon that many independent researchers have begun to discuss in recent years. A strategy known as Mar in the waters, literally. Muddying the waters. In terms of communications, this strategy consists of something quite simple, but extremely effective. Real information is deliberately mixed with false information, resulting in an information chaos where it becomes almost impossible to separate facts from inventions. Backwashments. When everything seems suspicious, in the end, nothing ends up being believed. And something similar seems to be happening with the so-called Epen files. Alleged leaked documents have begun to circulate on the internet, screenshots and photographs that many users claim to have found inside the declassified files. But upon closer analysis, several researchers have discovered that much of this material is completely false. Exaggerated stories, images generated by artificial intelligence, tales so extreme that they border on the absurd. The problem with all this is profound because when the internet is filled with false, exaggerated, or invented content, something dangerous happens. real evidence begins to lose strength. An authentic photograph can seem fake. A legitimate document can be dismissed as yet another conspiracy. And so, little by little, the truth ends up buried under a mountain of noise. It is the perfect setting for any scandal to happen, slowly disappears from the debate. Because when no one else knows what to believe, the conversation simply dies down. As a final reflection, and in light of all the mysteries surrounding this case, it's impossible not to wonder something bigger. How many people were really involved? How many victims were left out of the headlines? And how many stories are still hidden inside archives that we may never see? Cases like this tend to reveal something disturbing about the workings of power. The networks of influence, the close circles of politics, money, and social power, they mix in ways that are difficult to track. Perhaps that's why, even after so many silences, so many sealed documents, and so many unanswered questions, and this case continues to be investigated. Because while there are people looking for answers, Jeff's Us story has yet to be fully written. And perhaps one day, when we least expect it, the missing pieces of the puzzle will finally appear. I'm Brakeman, and this has been your break.